Infrastructure Fund, and specifically Tshiphiri Muedi, who's the head of infrastructure finance, and she is here to talk to us about what the IF or the Infrastructure Fund is and what its work is, what success stories do they have, and so on and so forth. And just as an intro, the IF is one of those initiatives that on our side we work very closely with. It was announced by the president in 2018, and really the need there was for it to address the need for blended finance solutions. And at the time, what the thinking was around it was looking at the constrained fiscal environment that we were in and that we still are. And it was saying, how best do we bring in the private sector into our public infrastructure delivery in terms of finances, in terms of expertise, in terms of instilling discipline, and so on and so forth, in support of large-scale infrastructure investments. And given how important this initiative is, government through the National Treasury, they made a commitment that 100 billion would be made available to support this important initiative over a 10-year period. And one of the things that I think is important about the IF was we give you 100 billion and we expect you to go and catalyze a lot more. And I think the numbers that we've been hearing is we give you 100 billion and we expect you to invest in the region of about 1 trillion, meaning that you have to go and raise 900 billion from elsewhere. So since that initiative was started a couple of years ago, as I said, in 2018, what we are going to hear today is around where we are, how exactly does it work, and all those kinds of issues. So without much further ado, I would like to ask Tshiphiri to introduce herself and to start with the presentation. And colleagues, as is the norm, that we will take the presentation first, and thereafter we will have our contributions, inputs, and question and answer session. Over to you, Tshiphiri.
Thank you so much, Witumelo, and thank you to GTEC for the invite this afternoon for the Infrastructure Fund to showcase what they do and what they've been doing in the last 2 years. As Witumelo has already indicated, my name is Tshiphiri Muedi, and I'm the head of infrastructure finance within the Infrastructure Fund. So today I'll be taking you through the presentation or showcasing what we've been doing and what we're currently doing. And for that, I'll just put off my camera for now so that the bandwidth doesn't get consumed a lot and you can hear me properly, and I'll switch it on again when we go through the questions and answers session. But I'm still here behind the camera. Just give me a moment to share the presentation with you. Please let me know if it's visible.
Yes, it is, Tshiphiri.
All right.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for your time during this rainy Friday afternoon, where we could all be cuddling in bed during this afternoon. So the topic for discussion today is showcasing the Infrastructure Fund. The presentation will be structured as follows. We will take you through the introduction to who the Infrastructure Fund is. This will include the background, how it was formed, the value proposition, as well as the stakeholders and the roles. We'll take you through the operations, how is it that we exactly operate, some of the key highlights from a strategic and operational point of view, the current deliverables, as well as some of the challenges. Because as we all know, as a new entity, there'll always be teething problems until we are established and our governance processes have been established and have been proven in the market. So in terms of our background, how exactly we came about to be created as the Infrastructure Fund. So it was in August 2019 when the cabinet approved the Infrastructure Fund as a ring-fence division within the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is the DBSA. And to start to operationalize this approval from cabinet, and then a tripartite memorandum of agreement, what we're referring to as an MOA in the presentation, was signed between Infrastructure South Africa, which is under the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, the National Treasury, and the DBSSA. And the head of Infrastructure Fund, who was the first employee of the Infrastructure Fund, was then appointed in October 2020. And effectively, it means that majority of the employees that you see in the Infrastructure Fund on the call today, most of us started from January 2021 up to now. So effectively, we've been operational for about 2 years. As already indicated above, the main partners are ISA, the National Treasury, the DBSA, the presidency from infrastructure coordinating role, the Minister of DPWI, and as well as public and private organs. So our value proposition was to use the funding that has been allocated to us to apply blended finance solutions and co-financing mechanism in mixed-use infrastructure projects and programs, while doing this to improve the commercial viability of projects and programs, try to alleviate pressures on the fiscus by taking that limited fiscus resources we've been allocated and blending it with private investment to allow the speedy implementation of infrastructure projects in the country, as well as to just create that sustainable infrastructure development ecosystem where you don't have to wait for years before the next big infrastructure project is implemented. Then this includes accelerating, scaling up, and catalyzing infrastructure development and implementation, and of course, to drive the necessary socio-economic development. As we all know that infrastructure is a catalyzer for socio-economic development in this country and around the world. In terms of our vision, mission, and values, I won't focus much on this. It's just to be a center of excellence in innovative blended finance solution and sustainable vehicle for accelerated infrastructure, where we will facilitate access to affordable and sustainable socio-economic infrastructure that promotes inclusive economic growth and job creation. So in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the three parties to the MOA, which is ISA, DBSA, and the National Treasury, the ISA's main role is to coordinate the development, assessment, and management and project preparation of a infrastructure pipeline. Effectively, this means that all the infrastructure projects in South Africa have to be registered with Infrastructure South Africa. And those that require blended financing and IF participation are then routed via Infrastructure South Africa to the Infrastructure Fund. We also have to submit our projects for official admitting into the Infrastructure Fund to ISA, as to be recognized in the infrastructure value chain in the country as an Infrastructure Fund project. They're also part of developing the eligibility criteria of the various projects, and they also have to approve the Infrastructure Fund business plan on an annual basis. And in terms of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA, this is where the Infrastructure Fund is located as a ring fence unit within the DBSA. So it means that we don't necessarily follow the established governance process, all the established governance processes within the DBSA. We are ring fenced within the DBSA in such a way that we had to develop our own governance processes between the three parties, and we continue to do so as we are completing our establishment processes. So this ring fencing enables us to also create strict Chinese wall and information barriers so that we are not seen as an entity that is just preparing projects for the sole purpose of the DBSA, who is funding projects alongside other commercial funders and DFIs in the market. But we need to be preparing projects for the entire market. One of their core role as well is to fund 50% of the costs of the infrastructure fund. This is the operational cost. They were also responsible for appointing the head of the infrastructure fund, who's the chief investment officer, and also recruitment resources. So all of us who work in the infrastructure fund were recruited through the DBSA, and we're part of the DBSA family in terms of that governance. They also help us maintain internal controls, accounting records, and we use a lot of their processes, although we don't necessarily adhere to all the project approval processes from an administrative point of view. We use a lot of their established processes. They were also responsible for setting up our advisory committee, which is the Infrastructure Fund Strategic Advisory Committee, which is IFSEC in short. And where required, they also provide procurement support for the projects on behalf of project owners. So if we have any procurement initiatives, will follow the DBSA procurement rules. The National Treasury is responsible first and foremost. They provide the funding, the 100 billion for the approach that we can invest directly into the project. And this is done through submission of our projects to the budget facility for infrastructure that we submit during the relevant windows annually alongside with the project owners and the national departments. They also facilitate the funding recommendations through MINCOMBAT and Parliament. They also, with DBSA, they fund the balance of the 50% of our operational costs for the first 5 years. And they also approve the IF business plan. So the DBSA also has to approve, all the three parties essentially have to approve our business plan on an annual basis. In terms of the funding allocation for the projects, I think Boitumelo indicated that 100 billion rand has been said to be allocated to the infrastructure fund with an intention of catalyzing a further 900 million in private financing to implement projects of up to 1 trillion rands in the next 10 years. However, that allocation of the 100 billion is not all upfront from when we started operating. That allocation is provisionally allocated in each medium-term expenditure framework. It's a provisional allocation. As you can see, for the current MTEF period, that was announced that we are operating under in 2023 and 2024, 8 billion was allocated. In 2024 to 25, 12.6 billion, 2025-26, 10.8 billion. So in total, 31.4 billion has been allocated, and this will roll over the following MTEF periods as the years go by. So, but it's a provisional, what the audience must understand, it's a provisional allocation. We still need to go through the budget facility for infrastructure, which is a national treasury process, to submit projects proposals, which will help us unlock this financing. You'll see further on when we go through the projects that we've submitted and those that we've been successful on and those that we've not been successful on. So the budget allocation will be revised on an annual basis, and obviously the next budget speech is towards the end of this month in February 2023. So we'll be able to update the slide as the time goes on. In terms of the priority sectors, these are the priority sectors that are recognized by both Infrastructure South Africa, ISA, and also under the budget facility for infrastructure, which is the energy, water and sanitation, transport, human settlements, telecommunication, agriculture, education, and municipal infrastructure. However, I must say in this that, our role is more seen in the more social type of infrastructure projects. Most of those projects like water and sanitation that are more social in nature, whereby other sectors such as energy, they are commercially bankable on their stand alone. So we've got limited role that we can play, as there are many commercial funders, private funders, and DFIs that are already participating in that market, and there is not a lack of bankable projects. So in terms of our application thresholds, it's 1 billion for a project, for a single project, and 3 billion if it's a program. And in terms of who do we work with, we working with government entities in all spheres of government. It can be national department, SOEs, it's water boards, municipalities, various entities that we working with, trying to progress some of these infrastructure projects. In terms of our value chain, so our process starts as indicated that every project that we do has to be registered through ISA, which is, so that pipeline identification can come directly from ISA, or we can engage directly with the sponsors and we say, this is a viable project for the infrastructure fund. However, we still need to take it back to stage 1, where we have to, alongside with the sponsor, submit it to ISA to be registered as an IF pipeline project. Once that is done, then we'll review the feasibility study and the bankable feasibility documents to just look at, trying to program design, if it's a program, or project design structuring, if it's a single project. Once we satisfy that the project is shovel ready and is ready for financing, then we need to submit an application to the budget facility for infrastructure processes through the National Treasury, which is stage 3 that you're seeing on the slide. And this is an annual process. They normally, in the last 2 years that the infrastructure fund has been operating, there's been 2 windows where we are able to submit projects for consideration. It was the 31st of May window and also the 30th of June window. And once that process is done, National Treasury goes through its own internal process, which normally takes about 5-6 months, I would say. So we normally get, if we submit in June, we normally get an answer around November, December, whether that project has been successful or not. And then if it's approved, then we work with the sponsors to try and finalize any preparatory work and then get the project ready for financing in the open market through attracting private financiers. And then once it reaches financial close, and then it's ready for implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So I think in a lot of people's mind, there's always a question as to what exactly is blended financing. So if you look at the diagram in front of you, it's showing you the various levels of financial resources as well as asset financial performance. So you'll naturally have those projects that are totally social in nature, where there is no way where you can raise private financing to support them. Those normally require the blue at the bottom to be financed through grants and subsidies. Those projects, sometimes they are not even profit making, they are implemented for the greater of society, and they don't need any commercial funding. The infrastructure fund, if that project doesn't need any commercial funding, will not necessarily participate. So that's where you will see government capital contribution, guarantees, incentives are being used to finance these types of projects. Then on the other side, you've got fully commercial projects, like if you think about the IPP, renewable energy IPP type of projects, where you've got full credit with the sponsors and developers, and you've got a guarantee from the government that makes that project commercially bankable and a standalone, then that project is commercially financed with a bit of sponsor funding. So those projects we don't necessarily touch because we don't want to distort the role of those financiers that are already available with their private financing. But there are those projects that are kind of in the middle. They've just been sitting in the infrastructure landscape. They are not moving anywhere. But if you just do something as government, if you just put a facility to just get it over the break-even point, then you'll be able to catalyze commercial finance participation. And this is the gap where it's being shown in yellow in the middle, where the infrastructure fund is supposed to participate to help those projects that are without any help. They are not fully government fiscals, 100% fiscals funded types of projects. They are also not 100% commercially attractive out there, but you need to put in some kind of instrument, whether it's a subordinated loan, it's a guarantee, it's some kind of tenure extension, some concessional funding, then it makes sense for the commercial funders to come in. This is where the infrastructure fund is supposed to operate. So in that type of funding, we blend those instruments that we come up with senior debt from the private market, whether it's DFIs or commercial banks or institutional investors and international funders, as well as the contribution from government, and that makes a total project bankable. So most of our projects you'll see are structured in this manner because that is where our mandate is limited to. In terms of the IF organizational structure, as already indicated, we are led by Mohale Rakhate, who's the Chief Investment Officer. There's about 4 units. One looks at a project pipeline, one looks at the financing, one looks at the asset management, and we also have legal. A lot of my colleagues are on the line, and I will call them to help with some of the questions after the presentations. In total, I think we are about 14 or 15, a team of 14 or 15 people, supported by 2 graduate interns who are also on the line. In terms of our advisory board that I talked to earlier, we've got a team of a board of 9 members composed of private sector, composed of members from the private sector as well as the public sectors, where we can submit our projects and seek guidance. They are not an approval board. They are an advisory board. They are advisors on the operations of the IF as well as the structuring of the infrastructure fund. So they don't operate like a normal DBSA board where they will be approving the projects. Our projects essentially are approved through the National Treasury in terms of the funding and in terms of the pipeline through ISA structures. Some of the key highlights, we've been, as indicated, we've only been existing for about 2 years. We've gone through the establishment processes that we've attained. We're still going through the journey. As you're starting a new baby, it takes a while before you are fully established. So, but most of the establishment processes for now, I would say they've been attained. There's still a lot we are learning and we are refining as we go along. We also hold we've been having a number of roadshows with different stakeholders, whether it's sponsors, whether it's commercial funders, DFIs, other stakeholders, just to introduce a forum such as this one, just to introduce just to introduce ourselves to the market as to who we are, what we do, and what we're looking for. And in general, we've received positive media coverage. In terms of strategic and operational updates, so when the infrastructure was envisaged, obviously as a new entity, you find that sometimes once you start operating and you start taking the idea from paper, from a theoretical basis to an operational basis, you find that there's certain things that are not working as ideally as all parties would have loved. So currently there are discussions about certain IF reforms to allow us to be more flexible and more efficient. And these are being held at a higher level, at ministerial level, by the ministers, by the various ministers responsible for the infrastructure fund. So Minister Gungubele from the presidency, from finance, Godogwane, and from DPWI, have regular engagements where they are talking about how do we make the infrastructure fund as it is currently, now that it's been operating for 2 years, more efficient and more ready to be able to respond to the requirements of infrastructure in the country. Those discussions are ongoing. In terms of BFI approvals, this is where we get approved for our various projects. In the first year in 2021, I think we submitted 3 projects. I'll go through the slide at a much later. There's a slide coming with the projects that were approved in 2021. I think from there, I think 3 projects were approved through the BFI. And then last year we submitted 8 projects, 4 of which were approved. We'll show you the figures in subsequent slide. And in terms of some of the progress of the projects that we're doing, we are looking at a social housing program where we've recently signed the financing agreements, and we are looking to reach financial close by the end of this financial year. In terms of support, we've been supported by also multilateral financiers and other international DFIs. And in this regard, we received funding from AFD that has allowed us to augment our internal IF capacity and appoint an internet and finance infrastructure financing expert that will be sitting with us for the next 2 years. He's just recently started, and we're looking forward to his input and his ideas, obviously, given his international experience as well. In terms of the advanced programs and projects, these are the projects I was talking to that were approved in 2021. We've got the social housing program, which I already spoke to. Under this program, we're going to be implementing about 4 projects, 2 of which I've already indicated that we've signed facility financing agreements, and 2 of which we're currently doing the relevant due diligences with the idea that we will sign those facility agreements imminently. We've got the upgrade. This project, we were allocated about 305 million through the budget facility for infrastructure, and the balance of the funding comes from the capital grant through the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. We've got the upgrade and refurbishment of Olifants Port and Ebenezer Water Supply Scheme. This is the scheme supplying the Polokwane region and surrounds. Under that project, we allocated 1.4 billion. We're currently helping the sponsors with moving the project forward to a level where we can approach the market for financing. We've got another project, although we have not applied through the BFI for financing. Since the infrastructure fund started, we've been helping the Department of Home Affairs to develop to further develop the redevelopment of ports of entry program, which is a program looking at the modernizing of 6 points of entries around South Africa. It's a PPP program, and we are progressing well. We've been working with the DBSA Project Preparation Department, Department of Home Affairs, DPWI, as they own the land and the infrastructure, as well as the National Treasury to unlock this project. In terms of the last year's June BFI projects and programs, we've got 4 projects that were allocated funding as indicated. And the map just shows you where those projects are located. We've got the two catalyse projects, which are bulk water infrastructure projects, one in Limpopo, one in Northwest, where you can see we've received an allocation there. We've got Lupereng multi-use development project, which is a housing project in the south of Joburg. And we've got the Unkomazi water scheme, which is a water scheme in the Mgeni river system. In total, we got an allocation of about 17.7 billion from our provisional allocation. This is through the MTEF period and beyond, as some of the projects are implemented for periods longer than 3 years. MTEF period only looks at 3 years. And the total project cost is estimated at about 39.8 billion. And it is envisaged that for the balance of that financing, those projects will need to go out to the market to raise commercial funding. In terms of other projects that we had submitted and were not approved, we were looking at the Lanseria wastewater treatment works, the student housing infrastructure program, the Transnet Mocha manganese export terminal, and also the Transnet Cape Town container terminal. We currently engaging with project sponsors to try and address the information gaps identified through the evaluation by the budget facility for infrastructure processes. And then with an idea that we'll be able to resubmit these projects and in future when those gaps have been addressed. In terms of our outlook for future projects, these are projects, some of the projects we're currently working on. The projects are at different phases of development. Some of them we might submit to the BFI this year. Some of it we might look at submitting at future dates. So we work closely with the sponsors to identify the gaps and see where we can come in and try to address some of these gaps. And as well as we work closely with the DBSA project preparation department, where if a project comes to our hands and we see that, in terms of preparation, it's just not yet there, it still needs some work, then we send it to them to try and unlock funding. Some of the funding is from the BFI, but they can also access some of the funding, project preparation funding through the DBSA in order to advance some of these projects. Some of the challenges that we've come across since we started operating in 2021, in terms of specific sponsors-related challenges, is that from a project preparation capacity, we find that majority of the project focused on technical feasibility and commercial, and they think that the project is ready for implementation and the market, and they forget to consider the commercial feasibility, which will look at the financing and the legal as well, and just the bankability is not done. So we find that, most projects, when they come to our hands, we still need to do a lot of work before those projects we can say they're ready for financing, in terms of preparing it for commercial feasibility and bankability. And then for most entities, most of our government entities in general, there is generally a lack of project management is a challenge. So just obtaining all the information that you require to do your job as a financier in the market becomes a very tedious exercise. Obviously, if you're working without the government ecosystem, we all know the stability challenges within our government institutions. Some governments, at the executive level, there's a lot of changes that brings instability in the projects. So you make 3 steps forward, and then you have to move 2 steps back so that you can appraise the new person that is heading that organization and make them comfortable to move forward. That also delays our projects a lot. And there's also just a general lack of understanding of fundraising requirements. So as the IF, we find that we really need to educate the sponsors, take them along with us to say, we are not necessarily auditing you and your books, but if you want to go out to the market to raise the necessary financing, this is how transparent you need to be to the lenders. So there's a general mindset shift that we need to instill to just get some of these projects to move. And lastly, just from a financial health of government institutions, normally you've got weak balance sheets and at times qualified audit of sponsor entities. Some audited statements are outdated. You also have issues on how strong from a financial perspective your off-takers are. And some structuring and thinking around and innovation around to get around that in order to be attractive to the market is required. So that's what we also spend a bit of time on. And then in terms of internal infrastructure challenges themselves, sponsor retention, we find that, before we go to the BFI, the relationship with the sponsors is very good. But once there is that allocation of funding from the BFI, and also depending on how the fund the funding flow has been allocated, then they don't necessarily play ball, and which is a challenge. We are in discussions with National Treasury to see how we can get around some of those challenges and make sure that if we go to the BFI with sponsors, we can retain them and walk the journey with us and implement that project still as envisaged as a blended finance project. From the operational setup of the IF, I think I've spoken to this where I was speaking about the regular meetings of the ministers to just, from an operational perspective, to just remove some of the bottlenecks. And there's a suggested solution to create what they call a center of excellence. This will communicate once those discussions and behind the scenes have been finalized. And in terms of the IF legal status, obviously, yes, we are located within the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We are not a standalone legal entity in terms of any act, in terms of the Companies Act or any act implementing a government entity. So there's also those challenges that are being discussed in the background, and that we're hoping that they will be resolved to allow us to operate fully as a fund as initially envisaged. So in terms of sponsor retention, we've been having discussions with National Treasury in that we're proposing mitigants for sponsor retention. And some of the suggestion is to introduce a clause in the final allocation letters under the Division of Revenue Bill and Appropriation Bill and the related conditional grants framework. And also to just, make it a requirement that if a sponsor comes with the IF to the BFI, if they think that after the BFI allocation, they can go on their own, then it's a no-go for the National Treasury, for example. So these are some of the discussions that are still ongoing to remove some of the challenges that we are facing as the infrastructure fund. And then in terms of just if you want to read what we've been doing in the last 2 years, where there was a publication that was done called the IF Journey 2020 to 2022. It can be found in the attached link is on the DBSA website. It's a public document that's available to any one of us to read. I think thank you so much for the opportunity. I'll leave it here and make time for questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Tshiphiri, for the for the presentation. Thank you very much. I think you have, I hope, for colleagues on the line, you have clarified some of the questions that people may have had coming on to the session. What I'm going to do now is to open for contributions as well as question and answer. I mean, as you were talking, Tshiphiri, there was already one or two questions, in fact, 3 questions, and I'll read them out for you. I know you were presenting, so you didn't necessarily get a chance to look at them. And the first one is people want to know how does the local government, municipalities and the like, access the fund. And maybe that's one of the things you have to clarify, to say the infrastructure fund is not really about accessing the fund. It's about, it's about something that's bigger than that. And then there's a question from Landiwe, which I think is a pertinent question, to say, how do you define your value add, and how do you differentiate the work that you do versus the work that the DBSA does? And I know you touched on this a little bit when you started with the presentation, but I think it might help to sort of go into a little bit of detail around how that is done. Then there's another question around climate change, to say, what is the appetite for the IF on infrastructure that's related to climate adaptation and mitigation? And then, the last question at the moment that we've got on the chat is plans that the IF has in relation to addressing the sponsor challenges that you flighted. Especially those that speak to capabilities within government. And those are the questions at the moment. And what I will do is, they are quite a mouthful. Maybe let's take that first round, and you can also ask your other team members to help with the questions, with the answers, and thereafter we'll take the second round. Yeah, let's do that.
Thanks, Vitumelo, and thanks, colleagues, for those questions. So I think I'm going to also ask my team members to come in and help answer some of the question. I think I will answer the question with Landiwe's question relating to how do you define your value add and how do you differentiate with what the DBSA does. If Refilwe, you can come in and help with the question on climate mitigation projects. Ms. Saveni, if you can come in and help with the question on how does the local government can access the fund. And I'll also cover the plans that the IF has in addressing sponsor challenges. So I'll start, and then my colleagues can come in after me. So with regards to how do we define the value add, I think as indicated in that diagram where we showed blended financing, you will realize that most of the projects that the DBSA are operating on are commercial type of project, except maybe a few under the municipality where they've got various programs where they are looking at under-resourced municipalities and trying to find ways to help them. Where our value add is, we are looking at those projects where without our intervention, they will not even get to the DBSA's table or any financier's table. So we are looking at those projects that have been in the market for so long, but due to a reason of challenges, whether it's tariffs that are too high, whether it's because the commercial case has never been prepared and no one has the capability to prepare it, then we come in and assist them to just get over that line to the place where we can say, after we've put in the blended financing instrument and help them prepare the necessary documentation, such as the financial model, the project information memorandum, expression of interest, and term sheet, we can then take them to the market. So that is the gap where we are operating, where we're looking at those projects that they're lying in the system, but they have not been made commercially bankable. So we are trying to get those projects over the line so that we can then send them to the likes of DBSA and commercial lenders to attract that commercial funding and the other private financing. In terms of the plans that the IF has in addressing sponsor challenges, this is a constant battle that we need to deal with, and we look at each sponsor on a case-for-case basis. And some of the initiatives that we've done in order to just help sponsors in the preparation, we've also developed some application guidelines based on the BFI that we share with sponsors. We also take our time to just handhold the sponsors to get over the line. But where we see that the resistance, it's so much that you are not getting any traction on the project, then we at a high level, we can take a decision and say, let's write an official letter to the highest level of government and make a decision that, what, for now, let's stop supporting them until they come back to the table and say they want our help. Because obviously you cannot help. It's very difficult to help a sponsor that does not want to accept your help. It makes it difficult to move on any initiatives that you would like to move. But it's not an easy task. But we try our best in each and every project that we deal with. And I think if you speak to sponsors that we've worked with so far, they can attest to that value add of just simply moving those projects along. Sometimes it's just setting up a project steering committee between the sponsors, ourselves, as well as the parent department, and start moving those things that have been outstanding for a long time. We also, what we're doing in the background is we're also getting support from the project preparation department of the DBSA, where they have capability of project management. So in projects where we see that it's a huge lag, we also bring them in so that they can just help the sponsor to get consolidated and organized and help us to move at a much quicker rate. Thanks. I think Ms. Sabeni, you can come in on the local government question and then refill on the climate mitigation question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tshiphiri, and good day, everyone. So, in relation to how project sponsors like municipalities access the infrastructure fund, there are different mechanisms of doing that. Firstly, they can be referred to the IF by Infrastructure South Africa. You would know that they help sponsors to deal with packaging and preparation. And so if they see that there are candidates for blended finance in relation to projects, then they refer them to the infrastructure fund. Actually, holistically, we can't even start to go to BFI without aligning with ISA and the National Infrastructure Plan. In relation to other ways, we also have direct engagements with municipalities and any other project sponsors. We have done roadshows with entities like SALGA, MISA, and municipalities themselves to be able to explain the value add of the infrastructure fund. And through that process, those who are interested, those who have good projects as candidates for blended finance, then they have relationships with us. We also have strategic engagements with National Treasury and segments like the city support program, where we then get a platform to engage with the metros, and through that process we have largely benefited from sponsors who then come and approach us. I mean, few metros have approached us in that regard. The BFI itself, post evaluation, they tend to refer to us blended finance projects that perhaps still needs support around project prep, and as well as correct structuring in relation to blended finance. Lastly, there's also what we call word of mouth. So sponsors that are happy would then talk to others to say, perhaps approach the fund and you could be assisted in this regard. The last point is what Tshiphiri indicated around we issue annual application guidelines explaining the criteria. These are linked to the BFI process as we, feed into the BFI, just to avoid confusion. So yeah, those are some of the ways in which we get to engage with project sponsors, including municipalities. Thanks.
Thanks, Msabeni. Oh, sorry, there's a refill.
Sorry.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Mashilo, and good afternoon, former colleagues. It's good to engage with you from a different perspective. On the question on whether there's an appetite for the infrastructure fund to engage in climate or environmentally friendly kind of projects. Yes, there is definitely an appetite to engage with quite a number of institutions and projects that have a climate finance or initiatives on them. However, I must say that there is a dedicated unit within the DBSA that specializes in climate finance. And we've engaged with them before on projects, those projects that fall within the sectors that have been specified to us and have an element of climate finance, where they have we have collaborated with them because we realized that in order to implement infrastructure effectively in South Africa, we need to collaborate with quite a number of institutions. So we have collaborated with them, and to the extent that a project which is within the infrastructure fund has those elements of climate finance, we can collaborate with them. They've indicated that there's some grant funding that is available to the extent that the project can obviously meet the requirements of climate finance and climate environment and so on. So yes, there is definitely appetite on those kind of projects, especially because right now, climate finance initiatives or environmentally kind of projects, are a buzzword in the country. So there's definitely that appetite for us to engage with anyone who has a project on that particular element. Thanks.
Thanks, colleagues. I'm surprised that today we are talking on the chat. I was hoping that we would get people to actually say a few things verbally. So let me just check with a round of, if we can take a round where people are willing to sort of put their voice to the questions. If you can just use the raise hand function, and then we can recognize you. I just want to hear other voices. Anyone? Any takers? Not really. All right. Tshiphiri. Oh, I see a hand from Laila and Marisa in that order.
Thank you. I don't know if this was perhaps mentioned earlier, but is there like a minimum or rather a maximum percentage between the public finance and the total? Where, I mean, I heard before 1 to 9, I think it was. But I also saw in some of the real life projects, it looks like it's a 1 to 3. So is there a hard and fast rule or not really? Thank you.
Marisa?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, there's two questions. One is, I was wondering if there are considerations for pooled concessionary finance or pooled grant funding, especially if we start looking at regional projects in water. So if there are opportunities to look at that. And then secondly, I picked up your solution to put the requirement to meet with the fund through the allocation letter. And I was wondering if there's any options to also think about getting the private financing as a condition to access the public finance, so that you force the blended finance as opposed to hope it will arise once the fiscus is funded. Thank you.
Yep. All right.
Okay.
Tshiphiri, while you're at it, you can also take, I don't know which ones have not been responded to on the chat. You can also take the opportunity to do those as well.
All right, no, thanks, Vitumelo. And so I think I'll start with Lila's question. With regards to the maximum, the ratio of blended financing to private financing, yes, you're absolutely correct. We've been tasked to, we essentially been given 100 billion, not given, provisionally allocated 100 billion with an intention that over 10 years will catalyze up to 900 million. However, when you look at a specific project, some of those dynamics come from how that sector funds the project. So it's not always up to us to determine this is how we're going to. So we're going to give you the 10%, you need to go obtain the 90%. So for example, if you look at social housing is structured in such a way that between 60 and 70% is provided through that grant via the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. So the viability gap is only on the 30%. So you cannot get over that regulatory framework. So I think as the years goes by, our project mix will grow. And I think right now we are skewed towards certain sectors, and we're hoping that as we grow, as well as the infrastructure fund, our sector mix will grow, then it will open up more financing. Because if you look at also the water sector, you cannot decide for yourself how much commercial funding you want to attract. When the projects, the feasibility study is done, it comes with a recommendation of what is the social component and what is the commercial component, and that is the basis upon which you fund. So there's also specific sector nuances that one has to deal with when considering the catalyzation of the financing. With regards to pooled grant funding, I hope I'm answering the question correctly. If I'm not, please come in again, Marisa. So I think we indicated that, if they are smaller projects, we can definitely look at making a program out of them, where we look at, the application goes as S1, but it's got a number of sub-projects that is targeted towards. That is how we have done the social housing program. And that is how we had proposed the student housing infrastructure program as well. So you can do that as long as you get over a certain threshold. You can definitely pull a number of projects, similar projects in a specific sector with the same mandate and under the same, national department and with the same objective. That's definitely can be done. And I think your suggestion that private finance, it becomes a condition to the BFI funding is definitely spot on. Those are some of the discussions that we're having at a high level with the National Treasury. And, we're hoping that, eventually we'll get to a point where that is a condition that is inserted into the approval letter for the financing. Obviously, as a government, they've been used to working in a certain way, and infrastructure fund is making them ultimately rethink of the way they've been doing things, and also think about how do they then also participate in this mandate of catalyzing financing from the market. Thanks. Ms. Abeni, I see infrastructure fund colleagues, you can also come in answering the questions on the chat, because sometimes I cannot read all of them. Thanks. Ms. Abeni, you can come in.
Yeah, thanks. So, Marisa, the part of the conditions that we have proposed with the National Treasury is that the co-funding element, so the grant shouldn't exist without the private financing. The catch in that approach is that in terms of the waterfall, in terms of how the funds flow, you want the grant to come in first so that it can de-risk the project. It instills confidence in the market. However, in the current dispensation, as you are saying, it doesn't work, because what is supposed to be blended finance projects, they then morph and become maintain the status quo, if you like. They just become grant funded, because eventually the sponsors don't have the appetite to conclude them as blended financing. I think perhaps what you are suggesting is that maybe the grant funding shouldn't flow when the market funding has not flowed. We need to check how we can kind of try and match that, given that infrastructure space is really driven by time, as well as there are costs when projects are not moving. But we are in discussions with the Treasury to resolve those issues. What we had proposed originally from ourselves was to say, perhaps for blended financing projects, the funding could flow to the infrastructure fund, and that would have solved all these problems, because you keep this money until you get the other piece. However, the PFMA and the MFMA currently are not structured like that, and we hope that with the reforms, we'll be able to find each other. And despite that, Marisa, we are trying to still move the needle within the framework within which we operate currently. Thanks.
Refila, you can come in.
Thanks. There's a question on the chat around the AFD on whether the funds that we've specified, is it a loan or a grant? What are the benefits of that, and whether it's meant for developing countries or not? Yes, we have received funds from the AFD, and it is a grant that we have received from them. So we're not meant to pay it back in any way. It's meant for us to develop the capacity around international expertise and looking at ways that other countries have, looked at the financing of infrastructure before. And I know that in economics, we always say that there's no free lunch, but this is indeed a free lunch in the sense that the AFD is not expecting anything back. I suppose the only benefit that they will have in terms of granting us this funding is that, obviously, as part of developing a pipeline of projects as the infrastructure fund and using those international expertise, we will hopefully unlock some of the projects, and maybe they can then participate on a competitive basis together with the rest of the DFI funding, DFIs that are out there. But we are not meant to give any specific preference to the AFD or even the DBSA that we are located within. That's why we always talk about the infrastructure fund as a ring-fence division of the DBSA. It's because even though we are within the DBSA, we realize that our role is a lot more than the DBSA, and we are creating a pipeline of project for the private sector and for the DFIs out there, and not necessarily for the AFD or the DBSA. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, Mr. Mdansi, around the fact that your pipeline is not necessarily meant to be for the exclusive participation of the DBSA. It is a platform through which DFIs, MDBs, any other kind of financier and lender can come in, and that's why the reforms that we are looking at, it's really about how do we actually make sure that you are fully ring-fenced from the DBSA, just so that these kinds of perceptions, and some of them are perceptions, but just to make sure that those Chinese walls are indeed there, so it's not seen as an indirect way of recapitalizing the DBSA. Look, on my side, and it's because I'm not seeing any other hands. There's sort of two things. The one is a question. I think the other one is it's more a comment. Or maybe they're both comments. I don't know. The first one is I would just like the IF to talk about how do you support triple Ps? So, how through the IF we are able to advance some of the triple P projects if we are able to do that, just so that colleagues also understand that in the space that you are in, you are not necessarily replacing the work and function of the triple P, but you can help in terms of advancing those projects. The second one is more me thinking out loud, and excuse me for that. I often wonder that was the IF established perhaps ahead of its time? In other words, we came up with a funding / financing solution to a real problem that exists out there, but it also coincided with the time that we were also trying to introduce other reforms that are able to generate, for example, a credible pipeline that would fit the IF, space and so on and so forth. And part of the reason why I'm asking this question is to say that the reason why you're experiencing some of the challenges that you are experiencing is because some people have not necessarily been fully convinced that they need the IF. That's one. Two, the type of projects that they have may not necessarily be ready for the market. Therefore, you are having to go upstream and do some of the work, which honestly speaking is not necessarily your role. But I think also linked to that, and for me, this one is important. If we limit blended finance to, it's just a platform through which we can bring in that one, without necessarily thinking about different delivery models that you can argue for, that you can advocate for, and say, for these kinds of projects, we think that we will achieve the most perhaps by going through a BOM kind of a structure. I don't see a sponsor saying that's how we want to do it, but I actually want to sort of hear your thoughts around how are you advocating for alternative ways of delivering infrastructure, because if we just limit it to financing, it's unlikely that we are going to move the needle, using the terminology that has been used on the line. So I know it's a lot of words. I hope you got what it is that I'm trying to say.
Thanks, Witumelo, for the tough questions. I see Rifule has his hand up, and any of the infrastructure colleagues, if you would like to come in, you can put up your hand. Rifule, you can come in, and then I'll come in after you.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mashilo, around the questions around, how we are assisting in terms of PPPs. And I think that's a valid question. In fact, we've engaged with the budget office team around PPPs in order to find ways that we can basically assist PPPs. Because if you look at the current, BFI process, it's not very clear exactly on how the PPP, procurement process is aligned with the BFI. And I'm of the view that the suggestion that Marisa made around the fact that we should have some kind of a condition that funds should only be accessed if they can be proved that indeed a certain project can attract some kind of private sector funding or work with the private sector in its development. And I think that's how ideally we would want, to engage with the National Treasury and have a debate around that, because we believe that the BFI process can actually be used a lot more in terms of attracting private sector funding. But in terms of PPPs, we are involved in 3 PPPs in the redevelopment of ports of entry. We're involved in the health PPP program, and we are also involved in another project that wasn't necessarily mentioned, which is the City of Johannesburg waste to energy project. And with for example, the redevelopment of ports of entry, we've been involved throughout the infrastructure value chain all the way from the process when we got involved. The project wasn't quite moving as it should, and we got in and became part of the steering committee. We were involved in the RFP that has been drafted. We were quite usually, documents like RFPs are not necessarily drafted by government, but rather by transaction advisors. But in our case, we were, even though they were drafted by the TAs, we were involved in the drafting to make sure that they are drafted such that they protect the interest of government. And in some cases, allowing the private sector to work closely with the infrastructure fund, especially in the co-funding of a project, and in some cases, including some clauses in the RFP, Mr. Mashilo, that allows the IF to come in and refinance some of this project. In PPPs, for example, when you come in as government and want to refinance some of these deals, it's almost impossible to do it. But the way we drafted the RFP allows for the infrastructure fund through the project sponsor to actually come in and refinance the project with minimal penalties. And that's the kind of role that we see ourselves playing in this kind of projects going forward. And again, in the negotiations, we see ourselves playing a role in the negotiations. There is research that shows that when it comes to value for money, the value for money for government always reduces when it comes to the negotiations in PPPs. And our strategy is to come in and negotiate on behalf of government so that that value for money that is shown at the time when the preferred bidder is selected is maintained throughout the entire process until financial close. So that's the kind of role that we see ourselves playing in the PPP space. And of course, in terms of the agency, most of the PPPs get stuck in the pipeline and don't quite proceed to financial close. And our role is to then collaborate the efforts of government in order to ensure that we ensure that the PPPs progress with speed and hopefully reach financial close. Thanks.
Thanks, Rifule. Ms. Abeni, you can come in quickly before I also come back. I see we only have about 3 minutes left. Thanks.
Okay, I think the first point that I wanted to make, Tshiphiri, is that so Boitumelo, I think there was no realization around the massive work that the IF is supposed to be doing around, blended financing. We sort of thought about, how to minimally tweak the status quo to push these investment rates. However, experience on the ground so far is proving that we need to think more around the appropriate institutionalization and operationalization of the IF for it to be able to do what it's supposed to do. And I'm happy that things have happened this way, by the way, because we have lessons which we can say projects work when funding flows go like this. They don't work when they go like this. Perhaps if the IF becomes an entity, it can work. Initially, it was difficult to argue for that because once you make certain arguments, you appear as if you are advocating for the funding without wanting to do the actual work. So I think we have proven concept in terms of what works and what doesn't work. We can borrow from those lessons to improve the IF. Tshiphiri, the other point is around, the alternative implementation models. So Boitumelo, for us to influence that, we need to be involved at the upstream level around feasibility studies when those are being planned, so that you can influence the technical options as well as the financing options. In some projects, we've been fortunate to be able to do that. In some, we only come in later on. The only thing that I want to say there is that procurement is the root of all evil, irrespective of what model or mode of implementation is there. And I don't want to talk beyond that. People just focus on procurement. That's the only thing that they see. Beyond that, nothing else. And we need to be able to change that, methodology or thinking. And I'm surprised that is happening like that, Boitumelo, because the IF in any of the mechanisms, we don't accept or interfere with the procurement mandate of sponsors. We actually just deal with blended financing, and they retain the responsibility to procure and implement projects. So I guess education that Tshiphiri was talking about earlier, we also need to invest in that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Benny. Just quickly from my side, I think even if we were to establish the IF maybe 2-3 years later, you will still discover the same problems, because I think the other entities are not necessarily focusing on financing. They are focusing on other aspects of infrastructure development. So I don't think there was an opportune time, but it has also allowed the government to unearth what the real issues behind infrastructure development. And maybe I'll even say the biggest issue is not necessarily the funding, it's the steps before the funding to prepare the project and for it to be ready for the market. So I don't think, there would be an ideal time, an opportune time. I think we would have run into the same issues had we been formed 5 years from now even. Thanks. I'll leave it here.
All right. No, that's fine. Thanks, thanks, colleagues. I didn't realize we were ending at 1:15. I thought it was 1:30, so I was very happy to cause along. But thanks, Tshiphiri and the IF colleagues. Honestly, thank you very much for clarifying the questions and educating us about what the IF is at the moment and what it could be, because I think there's also, some education that also needs to happen on that front. And I hope that colleagues on the line have also found this session helpful. We will share the presentation. I just don't know how we do it. Anita, do you send out an email or how do we share the presentation? Sorry,
Hi,
Anita?
afternoon, colleagues. Yes, Boitumelo, we share it on our knowledge hubs, which I've posted, and the recording of the session is also available on our YouTube channel for colleagues. So if you look in the chat, I've put the links so that people can access it.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that, Anita. Colleagues, thank you very much on this Friday afternoon. I hope after this, you can be rest assured that government is serious about infrastructure. Thank you and take care. Until next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
colleagues.
bye.
Thank you.